do when we're trying to drive people's behavior is to make use of what the psychologist Gabrielle Ettingen has called mental contrasting. So one of the ways that we can energize a particular goal is by contrasting where we are right now with where we'd like to be sometime in the future. And that gap between present and future creates energy. And that energy can then be driven towards the action that we're trying to develop. One of the things that this means is that it's important when communicating about change to make sure that people understand why it is that this change matters, so that people can, for themselves, contrast where they are right now with the future in order to be able to develop this energy that can then be used to create change. Now, the thing is, energy alone does not yield action. Energy just creates arousal. And if any of you have ever been stuck in traffic before, you know that you can generate a lot of energy while sitting in traffic because you have the goal to be somewhere else. And if you contrast your current state sitting in the car with where you want to be somewhere else, then you create a lot of energy. But in that moment, there's nothing you can do about it. And as a result, that energy just becomes frustration or rage. So we don't want energy without direction. What we want is energy with direction. And what that means is that when we're communicating about change to people, we want to motivate them by creating what I call the bridgeable gap. So the gap is that contrast between where I am right now and where I'd like to be. And we want to create that gap for people. We want to communicate about the change in a way that helps people to think about the fact that there's a gap between where they are and where they'd like to be. But then we also want to bridge that gap by helping people to see what actions they can take in the present that will help them to reach the goal that they as individuals and that the organization as a whole is trying to achieve. And so managing change means not only energizing people, but giving people specific direction so that they know which actions they're supposed to take that will help them to achieve that goal. And that becomes a central part of the communication plan that we create when we're engaging in change. So what do we want to do? When we communicate about the plan, what we want to do is to help people to create what has been called an implementation intention. And an implementation intention is a very specific plan for the actions people are going to take in order to do things differently in the future than they've done in the past. The implementation intention involves specific actions. So we know exactly what we're trying to do. And this may mean providing support for those actions if those actions are new ones and people aren't necessarily going to be skilled at those actions yet. They need to know exactly where and when they're going to perform those actions, and if that requires putting them on an agenda or calendar or giving other reminders for when to perform those actions, then that has to be part of communicating the plan. People need to know exactly what their role is in the plan itself and to understand how their role fits in with other roles. There are times where organizations divide the workflow across many different individuals and many different groups, and it can be hard to see sometimes why you need to do things in a particular way that's different from the way you've done them in the past, because you may not realize the downstream consequences of the actions that you've taken. And as a result, you resist making a change because it doesn't seem to make any sense that you should do things differently now than you've done them in the past. It now begins to feel like change just for the sake of change, which means that when you communicate to those individuals about why they're doing what they're doing. You need to help them to understand the role that they're playing within the overall change, and to help them to understand that sometimes there are going to be aspects of what they're being asked to do that don't necessarily seem to make sense when they only consider the work they're doing, but for them to recognize that part of what's happening is that they are easing processes for people down the line, and as a result, their work is extraordinarily important. It's also important when communicating about change to help people know what the obstacles are going to be to success, because if early on when you're making a change, people may feel like, well, if this is difficult to do, then perhaps I'm not doing it right. And now they begin to question the process of change. Now, anyone who's ever tried to change any kind of habit knows that there is a period where you have to think about lots of things that you never had to think about before. And so that can be a very frustrating moment. So one of the things we want to do is to help people to understand which aspects of the change are going to be difficult for them as individuals, which aspects of the change might be difficult for the organization as a whole, so that people have the appropriate expectations about how it is that this change is going to be carried out. And one of the reasons for communicating as much as possible about the change is that you are trying to build a certain degree of trust within the organization. Because the easiest thing for the human mind to do, if you think about that Go system buried deep inside people's brains, the easiest thing for that Go system to do is to do what you did last time. After all, most of you probably left your homes this morning on your way to work. Or whatever you were doing today, you engaged your normal routine, which you can do without thinking about it because your brain just wants to do what it did last time. In order to get people to expend the effort to do something differently in the future than they've done in the past, they have to trust that the plan that you are creating is going to work, and that they understand how the actions that they're taking fit into the overall structure. And in the absence of that, it can be very difficult to get people to buy into the change, and as a result, difficult to get them to want to participate in the new actions you're asking them to be a part of. Now, one of the things that this means is that when you are communicating about change, you want to let people know explicitly what could go wrong and what to look for. Okay? So some of the things, sometimes you may say to them, this is going to be difficult, and don't worry, that difficulty is perfectly normal. It will, it will get easier over time or better over time. But you also want people to know that there are some things that could go wrong. And here are the signs that actually the change is not going as we expected, so that people will be able to gauge to some degree what whether they and the organization are making progress in the change. It's useful to know what the time frame is. Is this a change where we expect to see results in 2 weeks, in 2 months, in 2 quarters? So we want people to understand what the time frame is, so that they are not just asking the organizational equivalent of that old question that 6-year-olds ask in the car, which is, are we there yet? And this means in particular that it's important to have tools that people can engage with, or at least general reports that you send, helping them to track their progress over time, both the progress of their own actions as well as the progress of the organization as a whole. And when you have these tools, then that in combination with particular signals that things are going well or not going well, that's what enables people to feel like they can provide feedback about whether the change is effective from the standpoint of their own group. And one of the reasons why it's so important to have these tools is that any long-term behavior change that you're trying to create, like an organizational change, bumps into a problem that people's mental time horizons are actually fairly short. It becomes difficult for us to remember what we were doing even 2 or 3 months ago, or 6 months ago, or a year ago. We don't have specific memories of those things. And so what happens is, after you begin to do something for a few weeks, that now begins to feel like the new normal. And as a result, you can't get a sense of how far have I come? How much progress have I made? How much progress has the entire organization made? Particularly if the key performance indicators that you're using to be able to track the effectiveness of a change are ones that move rather slowly. And so you want to be able to give people a way of tracking information that goes beyond just their lived experience in the moment, because even though for a few weeks they will think, oh yeah, we're in the middle of a change, after 8 weeks, they'll forget, has it been 2 months or 3 months or 4 months since we even started this? So giving people the opportunity to track behavior actually solves a lot of problems, because it helps people to pay attention to how long has this change been in process, how is the work that I'm doing different now than it was in the past, and to really be able to pay attention to the nature of the change itself. Now, I want to say a couple of words about habit change here. Habits are behaviors that people carry out without having to think about them. The human brain likes as much as possible to be able to do things mindlessly, to be able to remember what it is that you're supposed to do rather than having to think about what to do. And that's really what a habit is. A habit is what happens when the brain is able to retrieve information about what it's supposed to do in a situation faster than what you would have to do if you had to think through what you're supposed to do. And so what it does is to associate the environment that you're in with a particular behavior. And everyone that you know has a ton of habits that are associated with work. You have habits related to forms that you need to fill out, procedures that you need to engage. You have habits related to your own desktop. If you're working at your desk, it's set up in a particular way and you know where to find things. And whenever you create organizational change, whenever you create a new system, a new process, you are asking people to change their behaviors, and that habit change is going to be frustrating. Now, the standard question becomes, how long does it take for habits to change? And the answer is, of course, it depends, because what it depends on is how distinctive the memory is that you are, that relates the environment to the behavior. And the thing about work behaviors is that there are lots of different behaviors that are associated with the work environment, and as a result, those new behaviors are not that distinctive. And so it can take quite a bit of time before you can lay down enough memories to be faster to remember what to do than to have to think about what to do. And so you really want to give yourself 6 to 8 weeks of people feeling unsettled about the work environment before they're likely to start feeling more comfortable with the habits that you're asking them to change. And one of the reasons that this matters is because in that transition from one habit to another, people are going to go from a behavior that they were performing really well, really effectively, to something that they don't do that fluently, because they have to think about it, they have to pay attention to the steps, they might be more prone to make errors, and that can be frustrating. Whenever there's something you were good at, and now you have to change what you're doing and you get bad at it, this is something that can be frustrating for people, and they will take that frustration out on the work itself. So the more prepared you can get people for the frustration that they're likely to experience, the more that they are likely to feel better about the change itself. Because here's an interesting thing. When you experience frustration, you need to figure out what the cause of that frustration is, and you look around your environment to try to figure out what the cause is. The thing about your habits is many of those habits are things that you do mindlessly. And because they're things that you do mindlessly, you aren't even paying attention to the fact that you used to be able to do something one way and now you're doing something a different way. And as a result, when people are feeling frustrated because they change their behavior, they start looking around the environment trying to find something that will be the source of what's getting them frustrated, and they will land on the change that's being implemented by the organization, and they will now be frustrated by the change itself. And so now the change that you've tried to communicate so effectively is going to be the source of frustration. People are now going to be angry that they had to make this change because their habits aren't working so well. And so one of the things you want to do when you communicate about the change is to say, look, here's what's going to happen. As you begin to make this change, you're going to have about 6 weeks where things are frustrating because you're not sure what it is you're supposed to do. That frustration shouldn't be directed at the change. You should just recognize that that's a normal part of what happens whenever you have to change your habits. So accept that there's some frustration, but don't think that it is a sign that this change that we created was a bad idea. And help people to manage those expectations, help them to manage what it is that they do with that frustration. Okay. So we want to communicate about what that process of change is going to be about. And as we do this, one of the things we want to do is to recognize that people are going to come to the situation with a set of biases that they have that are going to influence the way that they react to a particular change. And I want to go through a few of these biases, and then we'll turn to take some questions from people. The first of the biases comes from something that is called construal level theory. And the idea behind construal level theory is that the further away something is from us in space, in time, or in social distance, the further it is, the more abstractly we tend to think about it. This is why, for example, when you heard about this webinar several weeks ago, you thought, wow, that sounds like a great idea. I can't wait to go do this, because you're just thinking about how nice it would be to hear a talk about behavior change and change management. And then this morning, as you looked at your calendar and saw that you had a webinar on it, you thought to yourself, I'm not sure why I signed up to do this because I have so much work to do today. I'm so busy. How do I even have the time to sit through this? And so when you get close up to something, you have to pay attention to all of the specific details that influence whether it's doable. And this affects our beliefs about change, because for one thing, change feels a whole heck of a lot easier to do from a distance than it does close up. From a distance, it just feels like, well, we're substituting one process for another. How hard could that be? But close up, we actually have to think about specifically what are the new actions that I'm taking, specifically which actions do I no longer want to take? Do I have to stop myself from taking? How am I going to stop that from happening? So it influences, change feels easier abstractly than it does specifically. So when you're up close to it, it may feel more difficult and more frustrating than it was when it was just communicated from a distance, which means that when we're communicating about the change from the beginning, we want to try to create opportunities for people to get psychologically nearer to that change, even when that change might be 3 months away. We want them to actually project themselves into, here's what your day looks like, here's how you're doing things differently at this time, so that people can begin to see some of the complexities of that change. In addition to that, the overall time frame is something that is hard to communicate effectively. If I say the word 6 months, well, it didn't take me very long to say the word 6 months. So 6 months doesn't feel like very much time when all I'm doing is talking about it in general. But when I'm living that 6 months, well, now that feels like an awfully long time. And so we need to take into account the fact that from a distance, the time frame of the change is going to feel easier to manage than it is when you have to actually deal with the day-to-day issues that come up while the change is in process. So we need to help people to be up close and personal with that change as we're communicating about it from the beginning, so that people appreciate the complexity. And this isn't just something that needs to be done with the people who are going to be experiencing the change. It also needs to be done with the people who are managing that change, and even the people who are approving that change. So a lot of times, for example, if you are a leader in an organization and you sit at your lofty perch, say up in the C-suite or in the executive lounge somewhere, in that situation, those people who are beneath you in the organization are somewhat socially distant. And as a result, their work can feel abstract to you. And so it may be difficult to internalize the amount of disruption that you're creating for people's day-to-day routines, the amount of frustration that individuals may feel, and to really appreciate that they may feel as though that frustration is justified because of the magnitude of the change that you're creating, which means we also need to take the high-level leadership that is approving a change and bring them up close and personal to the work lives of the people whose work is going to be affected by the change itself, so that when they approve that change, they have some amount of empathy for how difficult it's going to be for a number of people in the organization to make changes in their behavior, so that when they hear complaints and frustrations, that they actually have some understanding of where those are coming from, because it's easy for upper level administrators in an organization to have low levels of sympathy for the people whose lives were disrupted by the change, because it just feels like it shouldn't be that hard, because you were treating that work that everyone else was doing more abstractly than perhaps was warranted. A second bias that's really important has to do with overconfident. One of the things that we know is that people are, generally speaking, overconfident in their abilities. There's a great phenomenon in psychology called the Lake Wobegon effect, after the town from Prairie Home Companion, where the tagline for the town ends where all the children are above average. And if you were to ask people how good they are at things, on average, people think that they're better than average at a variety of skills. So we tend to be somewhat overconfident. And this is, by the way, most pronounced for the people who are least good at any given task. This is what's come to be known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, after some work by Dunning and Kruger. And what they found was that the least skilled people in any given domain are the ones who are most overconfident in their abilities, in large part because they are unaware of what really skilled performance looks like. Now, why does this matter? Because if you are overconfident in your ability to change, then you may not ask enough questions about how that change is going to happen. So you may not really be paying attention to some of the details that will actually be crucial for success in that change. And you may not even be willing at some point to admit that there are some things you don't understand about that change, particularly if the overall administration is very excited about this change. You might be concerned about voicing your concerns. What does this mean? It means that when we are communicating to everybody else about a change that we're about to implement, we really need to not just communicate about it, we need to over-communicate about it. So we may think it's sufficient to say something once, and then that'll be enough. We actually need to say it several times. We need to say it not just abstractly, but we really want to try to create specific scenarios for people to be thinking about the nature of that change. We want to help people to prepare for the difficulty. We want to make them think about all of the aspects of the work that they're going to do that are going to be disrupted by the change. Now, you might think, well, gosh, we don't want to do that. We have this change we're going to implement, and we know it's going to be hard. But if we start telling people how hard it's going to be, well, now they're just going to resist the change. They're going to revolt before we even get the change implemented. The problem is that all of those things you're worried about, the difficulties that individuals are going to have in making changes, all of those things really are going to happen whether you communicate effectively about them or not. And while you may get a little bit of initial buy-in by not emphasizing the difficulty of the change early on. If you don't talk to people about the complexity of what's going to happen, then when the change is implemented and it's difficult and it has complexities, then you actually will get more of a backlash. So now you will demotivate people because they will feel like, I don't know what's happening. It was supposed to be easier than this. I must be doing something wrong. Or this whole system may not be nearly as good as I was led to believe. And so if you communicate accurately and effectively about this, about the magnitude of the change that you're making, one of the things you're doing is preparing people to have to work through the difficulties. Because people can be motivated to solve problems if they believe that those problems are ones that were an expected part of the process of making change, rather than a signal that the organization had done something misguided. So you want to over-communicate, and to the extent possible, you'd like to get people to talk back to you about the change, to help get their view of what the change is like, so that you can correct any misconceptions about the change before the implementation happens, or as quickly as possible as the implementation starts. A lot of times people don't want to communicate about things, particularly if they either have concerns or if they're frustrated. So you want to create an environment in which people feel free to communicate. And one of the ways to do that is for you to model the kind of communication you want. You can even say to people, look, here are some of the frustrations I'm experiencing with this change, so that people can understand that this is a normal part of the change, and that even you recognize that this can be quite difficult. In addition to those biases, one of the things that there are a few other things that we want to be watching out for. One, of course, has to do with ownership of various processes before the change. So it's very important within an organization to understand whose jobs are being affected by the change, and to get them on board and enlist their help as quickly as possible. Because if my job is being affected, particularly if I have concerns that my job might be going away or diminishing in its importance, I may want to resist that change in order to preserve my standing in the organization. I might actually undermine those change efforts if I am concerned that this is going to have a negative impact on my career. You would like to be aware upfront whose jobs are being affected negatively by this change, and really get them on board. And if necessary, to help them to see what role that they can play in the future if the change is implemented, so that they don't resist the change in the hope of preserving some status that, if the change is being made, that job is going away, or that aspect of the job is going away. So we want to help people to work with us to move into the future. We also want to be aware of the history of the organization itself. This can be particularly difficult for people who are operating in a consulting role, either across organizations or across units within an organization, because there really can be change fatigue among certain groups of people. I had a chance to work with a military organization a while back, in which that organization had a new leader every 4 years or so, and that leader came in, every new leader came in with a new set of priorities. This was going to be the new way things were going to be done. And when you spoke to people across the organization, their feeling was, with the bigger changes, just duck your head down, keep doing what you were doing last time, and wait, because this too shall pass. In a couple of years, there'll be a new person coming in, and they'll have a new set of priorities. So you want to understand, are people buying into the change, or have they gotten so tired of the repeated set of changes that at this point they're not even going to engage fully, because they know that by the time this change has a chance to percolate through the organization, someone else is going to come in and undo all of it. So we want to know, is there fatigue on this? We want to figure out, do people have trust that the organization will follow through on the commitments that it's made? Organizations that have not followed through on things in the past, it can be very difficult for people to feel like putting in effort on this change is going to yield the kinds of results that they want. And so when implementing change, you really do want to be having discussions with people and to try to find out what it is that they're feeling about this going in, and to try to generate some amount of excitement. This can be particularly difficult when the change is associated with an overall change in leadership in an organization. So for example, if a new CEO has come in, then people may have some trepidations about the direction of the organization to begin with. And now when processes are being changed, you have to actually work to build trust with them. And one of the best ways you can do that is by giving people an opportunity to voice their concerns as well as the excitement that they might have, and help people to feel like those voices are being heard. So for example, if people make a really good suggestion about a change, be willing to consider revisions to that change that take into account the feedback of people who've been with the organization for a while, so that they feel like I have some chance to affect the way that the organization is working. And I think when you treat the change in a collaborative way like that, you provide more buy-in across the organization from the people who are being affected. So just to summarize before I take questions, one of the things we're trying to do when we implement change is to really energize that change. We want to recognize that we're trying to help people to reprogram that go system, which we're going to do by helping people to find bridgeable gaps, meaning we're going to contrast the present with a desired future to generate energy, and then give people a specific plan that will get us from the present to the future, so that people feel like the set of actions that they take part in will actually lead to the desired outcome. We want to communicate about change. We want to communicate about the plan, but also the obstacles and the frustrations, so that people will have a clear sense of of the time course of this change. And then we want to create trust with people by helping them to feel like they are really a valued part of the organization, and that this change is ultimately going to be one that will benefit them as well as other folks in the organization. So I'd be happy to take questions. This is the Choose Your Own Adventure portion of the program. And in order to take questions, the easiest way to do this would be to type them into the chat box. You can send them off to everybody. And as soon as we start getting questions, I will read them out and answer them. But yeah, let me know what you're thinking about here. And in the meantime, as people are typing their questions, I will say that I appreciate you guys coming to spend some lunchtime with us, and we love to get feedback both on the content of the talks that we give, as well as the technology itself. So we're certainly going to want to hear from you about the nature of the experience and whether you think this worked effectively. And we have a question here. How do you know how much change an organization can take? For instance, how do you identify when people just can't absorb any more change? That's a great question, and let me give you a few things to watch out for. One is to be aware of the history of significant changes in the organization. So you'd like people to feel like there's a certain degree of continuity in the work that they're doing. And so if people feel like, well, I just got used to this process and now you're pulling the rug out from underneath me and we're going to be doing something else, now, unless you can provide a really compelling business reason for wanting to make this change, you're going to have a hard time getting buy-in. Now, there can be compelling reasons. It may be that new information has come to light and this market is changing rapidly, and so there's going to be important changes that need to be made. But you have to realize that that's the point at which fatigue is going to be setting in, and when people don't feel like they've had any opportunity to work in a steady state. And I think that one of the things that you can do in order to get a sense of whether people, how people feel about change, is to really try to read the body language in meetings when you have discussions about the prospect of making a change. When people treat the idea of change with some degree of excitement or interest or discussion, that's one possibility. There's a situation in which I think people are excited about change, but there are times, and you can see it in a room, where you begin to talk about a change, and you can see the entire bodily expression of resignation. Right? The eyes glaze over, the shoulders slump, you get an audible sigh. And so I think that when people react to the prospect of change in that way, it probably means that you are putting them on the roller coaster once too often. We have another question. That says, on working to bridge the gap, curious to hear some more ideas on how to get people closer to the desired future state in the moment. Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that you can do is actually, I think there's two components. One of the things you want people to do, of course, is to think a little bit more specifically about the current workflow that they have, so that they understand the details in their own life that are going to be affected by the change. So that's one thing that you can do. And in fact, to the extent that you can actually get people in the context of change while they're thinking about the change, that can help them to understand the potential complexity of what they're trying to do. Now, as far as understanding what the desired future is going to look like, well, I mean, some of that depends on the nature of that future itself, but to the extent, for example, that there are software changes that are going to be made where you can actually give them mock-ups of the workflow, that can be helpful. To the extent that you can point to other organizations that have done similar things and look at some of what their day-to-day work looks like, that can be helpful. But also, when you're even at the earlier stages, when you are at the idea generation phase of this, one of the things you want people to do is not just to think abstractly about the change, but really to think about, okay, so if we were moving in this direction, ideally, what would my day-to-day life look like in a way that that might help them to make suggestions about what an ideal workflow would be, because there might be things that people, suggestions that people make when thinking in the context of their day-to-day lives that would be valuable to make the change happen more effectively. Let's see, we have another question here on redirection. So theoretically an action was supposed to work, but in practice it didn't work so much. How do you manage that redirection without people losing confidence in the change process overall? That's a great question. And I think, again, a lot of this comes down to trust. But to me, if something isn't working, then everybody knows it's not working. And if you continue to tell everybody, yep, it's working fine, when even it isn't working fine, that's the place at which people start to jump off the bus. Now, I want to distinguish two things here. There are times where the change is working, but it's happening more slowly, or it's a little bit more difficult than you expected, and you actually want people to keep pedaling in the same direction and give it a little bit more time. And if that's the case, again, you want to communicate, yes, I know this is frustrating. Yes, we said this was going to happen faster than it actually has, but here's what we think is happening and why we want to continue on this course. But if it's clear to everybody that the change that was supposed to be amazing has turned out to be less amazing, then rather than trying to, as the phrase goes, put lipstick on a pig, I think what we want to do is to we want to communicate flat out. You know what? This is not working as we expected. We have a team that's been trying to understand the process, actually engage people as quickly as possible in giving their opinions on why things aren't going well, so that people can feel like their voice is being heard in this, and then communicate as honestly as possible about this is what went wrong, and this is why we believe that the new change that we're making to the change process, this redirection, this is why we believe this is going to be successful. But it all comes back down to, do people trust in the organization? And one of the reasons why I believe it's really important to communicate the complexity of the change and the obstacles to that change up front is so that when something does go wrong, you weren't painting such a rosy picture of what was going to happen up front that people now begin to lose faith because you gave them an inappropriate sense of how easy it was going to be to implement this change. So I think that's one of the reasons for trying to communicate as effectively as possible from the beginning and as honestly as possible. I think that, again, there's a tendency, we often trade off short-term and long-term. And in the short term, it's always easier to tell people everything's going to be fine, this is going to be great. And if we bring up potential complexities early on, we run the risk that people are going to express some concern up front. But honestly, it saves us a tremendous amount of time in the long run if we're honest up front, partly for this reason, that if the change doesn't go as smoothly as we hoped it would, people understood that there were going to be complexities from the beginning. But the other thing is, the more that we are upfront about the potential obstacles, the more that we get to take advantage of the minds of everybody else who works for the organization, who may be able to come up with solutions to some of these problems that we didn't see, particularly when we take advantage of those people who are working at the front lines of the organization, where we may not have a complete view of what their day-to-day life looks like. And if we tell them, here's a complexity we're worried about, here's an obstacle we're worried about, they may actually step forward and say, you know what, that's actually easier to solve than you think if we just do it this way rather than that way. And so then we take advantage of people's expertise to become a part of the process of building that change. We'll give people another couple of seconds to see if any more questions come in. Oh, here we go. What are some ways to build trust, especially if it's been deteriorated by prior poor change management efforts? Boy, that's a great question. And I'm a big believer in being as honest as possible when it comes to dealing with change. And sometimes that honesty also has to involve acknowledging the poor efforts in the past. And so one of the ways to build trust is to step up and say, you know what, here's something we tried last year and it didn't work as effectively as we wanted it to, and really be as clear as possible about the problems that came up. Some of those problems may have been in the implementation of something, some of them may have been in the communication of the change, some of them may have been in painting too rosy a picture of what happened. But regardless of what the particular problems were in the past, it is important for the organization to step up and to say, this is what happened in the past. And to the extent that some of the same leaders are in place, they need to take some responsibility for that. Here's what happened on my watch, and we need to do this better in the future. And here's how we're going to do it better. Here is why we believe that the future is going to be different from the past. Will that necessarily create trust immediately? No. What it does is at least to acknowledge what everybody is already thinking. And so when you get that out into the open, then you create the grounding for more trust. Now, what people are going to be watching for is, how is the change handled as it gets implemented? And so people are going to be watching when something goes wrong. do people communicate about that? Do people take responsibility for some of the snags? You know, if the timeline, inevitably in many large change projects, the timeline gets pushed back. So there may, they may say, well, you may say, well, we're going to try and launch a particular piece of software for the organization by a particular date, but it may actually get pushed off for several months. You would like to keep people as informed of that as possible, particularly in those situations in which there's been a lack of trust in the past, so that people understand that you're on top of what's happening. You understand the way things look to other folks in the organization. It turns out that we often say honesty is the best policy, and there are very few circumstances in which that turns out not to be true in the long run. In the short term, honesty is often quite difficult because you have to admit some mistakes. You have to you run the risk of upsetting people in the short term. But generally speaking, the short-term communications can often be managed well, whereas when there's a long-term problem that you don't acknowledge, when you finally do have to come out and say, wow, this didn't work at all, now you create that major breach of trust that becomes extraordinarily difficult to overcome. And then it says, are trust-building communication also the best practices to help manage change fatigue? And what other tools help teams experience change fatigue? Yeah, so, if an organization is undergoing change fatigue, I mean, one of the biggest sources of change fatigue really is when in the past there's been almost a flavor of the month kind of change for a set of processes. And one of the reasons that can happen is when the organization has had difficulty diagnosing what has been the cause of prior business problems. And so if you're not quite sure why the business isn't succeeding as well as it could be, then you may try a whole series of things in the hope that one of these is the magic bullet that fixes the problems that are being experienced. And so that can then can manifest itself as change fatigue, because all of these changes are taking place, but nothing actually seems to be any different. So now, why am I going through it this way? Well, because it's communication matters only if you communicate the right kinds of things. And so I think it's important for people to try to understand not just what is going to change and how it's going to affect people, but to the extent possible to communicate why the change is being made and why this change feels like the right one, so that people can understand the business impact of the change that's being made and to try and create buy-in that way. And ultimately, I also think that people need to feel like they continue to believe in the mission of the organization. One of the things that change fatigue can signal is an erosion of people's belief that the organization itself is one whose goals that they share. Because if you keep being asked to change the way that you're doing your work, without feeling like that's had a discernible impact on the mission of the organization, at some point you begin to ask yourself, do I feel like I am aligned with the overall mission of the organization? And you may actually begin to feel like, you know what, maybe I'm not anymore. And so one of the things that you want to do when you are seeing a lot of change fatigue in people is really to work with them to try to help recommit everyone to what the organization is trying to accomplish and to relate the change that's being made to that mission. And frankly, if you can't align the change that's being made to the mission of the organization, you have to ask yourself whether this change is one that is fundamentally important to make in an environment in which you've already asked people to make lots and lots of different changes. And with that, we've hit 12:59, and so I'm going to turn this over to Louis, who has a couple of things to say on the way out.
I'd like to say thanks to Dr. Markman and thanks to all of you for joining us. Our next webinar will take place on November 28th and will feature Dr. Clay Spinuzzi discussing time management principles for professionals. I'll also be sending a follow-up email out to everyone that will include a recording of today's session as well as information regarding future webinars. If you have any comments or suggestions for improvement, please respond to the follow-up email. This was our first webinar and your feedback is much appreciated. Thanks again and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate you coming and spending some time with the folks here at HDO, and we hope to see you at some of our other webinars in the future.